Hi folks, this is Gary. Welcome to episode 2 of A Life on Wheels. If you want to see the best of a big city, and the worst, you should try driving taxi. I don't mean the streets and the buildings, they're just the backdrop to the human drama. From behind the wheel of a cab, you see everybody from society folks to stoned hippies, head-shaven Hare Krishnas, and homeless people trying to keep warm on cold sidewalks. You'll drive drunks and ladies of the evening, holier-than-thou types looking for your redemption, tough guys looking for a fight, and druggies looking for that next big hit. You know where the gay bars are, the best clubs, the blind pigs, and every 24-hour restaurant and drugstore and coffee shop. You know who's playing at what venue. Imagine seeing the Mamas and Papas or Led Zeppelin for only $5 a show. I drove cab in Toronto on the night shift in the late 60s and early 70s. My cousin Terry drove days. No, not that company. We worked for a gentleman named Bernie Gottlieb, a great guy who owned East End Taxi in Toronto. He promised that if we could keep his old cab running for another year, he'd get us a really nice new car. And good old number 45, a tired 69 Chevy, already had over 200,000 miles on it. It was so tired that it couldn't do over 60 miles per hour, downhill with a tailwind. So we did a valve job, actually it was cheaper just to replace the cylinder head, and rebuilt the car to keep it in service. Most fleet-owned taxis were basic full-size sedans with six-cylinder engines and automatic transmissions, power steering and brakes, maybe an AM radio as well. Low-price cars from Ford, Chevy, and Chrysler were pretty much the only vehicles you'd see being used as cabs in big cities for many years. The fleet divisions of the big three had decades of experience in supplying suitable running gear, the extra wiring and the heavy-duty components that would keep their cars running while handling potholes and poor drivers. These fleet cabs took a beating, with company drivers racking up over 100,000 miles a year in them. If your Chevy or Ford or Dodge cab did need work, parts were cheap and any garage could do the work. As I recall, at the time, there were shops that would install a rebuilt automatic transmission in a standard sedan for $149. Complete engines could be replaced in one day for less than the cost of a tune-up today. Well, Terry and I kept old 45 running, and Bernie kept his word and bought us a brand new taxi, a 1971 Ford Taxi package. Under the hood was a familiar 302 backed by a strong automatic trans. The interior wasn't plush, but it was roomy, with comfortable seating front and back. It even had air conditioning, every cabbie's dream back then, plus an AM radio with an 8-track stereo. When you practically live in a car, you appreciate anything that makes it more pleasant. I still have some of my old 8-track tapes, including the Woodstock album. Peace and love, man. To this day, songs by Three Dog Night, Sly and the Family Stone, or Creedence Clearwater bring back taxi memories. I was one of the few company drivers who stayed out all night until the sun came up and it was time to go get my day driver. Music helped me keep my sanity through those long hours cruising deserted streets or sitting in an empty mall parking lot at 3 a.m. hoping for a call. At first, I wasn't really happy with the way our new Ford ran or its mileage. Finally, a dealer mechanic admitted that it was the new emission controls causing the problems, and they couldn't touch it. Well, I could. Once it was out of warranty, which only took a couple of months, I swapped in a pre-smog distributor and rebuilt carburetor, and it ran way better. I also added a nice set of chrome wheels that I had lying around. Had to be the only cab in the city, maybe the province, with classy custom wheels. The Ford ran surprisingly strong, even getting a chirp from the rear tires shifting into second. So, of course, Terry and I took it to Cayuga Drag Strip one fine Sunday. The cab actually won a class trophy. Told the boss when we got back, and he thought it was great. And he took these shots of the car himself. That's our trophy on the hood. We put 95,000 miles on this tough Ford in about 10 months. And the only problem was an alternator failure. A 1-hour repair for less than $80. Roomy, comfortable, a pleasure to drive for over 12 hours at a time. Wish they still made affordable full-size sedans like this. The last one was the late great Ford Crown Victoria. And yes, I had one of those as well. Now if you'll excuse me, I'm going to wind up my meter, put on my Beatles Let It Be tape, and go cruise the strip for pickups. A few years later, in the mid-1970s, I worked in Toronto for a company called Comstock International. Comstock was an enormous construction company that did projects in North America and around the world, including work on the CN Tower in Toronto. Here I am, high up, checking on the work in progress. And not really. I get vertigo just looking at this. But I did get to watch the final topping off with a giant sky crane helicopter. Comstock was owned and directed by Mr. Charles Irwin Rathgeb. Known as the sportsman of the wealthy set, Mr. Rathgeb had raced jet planes, climbed mountains, piloted offshore power boats, gone big game hunting, you name it. He even had an Olympic gold medal hanging on the wall in his office. In the 60s, he had been a race car driver and owner of the Comstock Ford Auto Racing Team, which competed worldwide. Now, this is him shaking hands with Carroll Shelby. In the 70s, his business interests took most of his time, and he no longer raced, but he still had a keen and expert interest in cars. His daily driver was an Aston Martin DBS, and in his garage at home was a Ferrari Daytona GTB, among other vehicles. One of my jobs was to drive him to various meetings during the day as required, and it was a distinct pleasure. Mr. Rathgeb was very much a gentleman, easy to talk to, and when he found out I was a car enthusiast, we had great chats about his racing experience and cars. My daily driver at Comstock was a Ford Country Squire wagon, a slightly rusty but trusty workhorse. Does anybody else miss those big wagons with acres of imitation wood paneling? One fine spring morning, Mr. Rathgeb called me to his office and asked if I could go to his house, pick up his car, and give it a good run. Which car? His Ferrari Daytona 365 GTB, which had been sitting all winter and needed to be exercised, then dropped off at the dealer for a tune-up and oil change. I said I would certainly find the time to handle that, and off I went. I believe his was one of the first Daytonas in Canada, a perfect mint model in a Rest Me red with Barani wire wheels, less than 20,000 miles on it. Note the personal license plate, my boss's initials plus the car's top speed in miles per hour. This was a satisfying car to drive, the epitome of classic Ferrari front-engine grand touring cars. It was very fast, screaming up through the gears to redline, then stopping as if you'd dropped an anchor. All of the controls worked with satisfying precision, even if the clutch took some effort and the steering was a bit heavy at low speed. The transmission was at the rear of the car, giving it superior weight distribution. It's no wonder that Motor Trend called the Daytona the best sports car in the world. The Daytona had done well at Le Mans, coming in 5th overall in 1971, then winning the GT class, 72, 73, and 74. Under the hood was a jewel of an engine, a 4.4-liter double overhead cam V12 that put out 347 horsepower, backed up by a gated 5-speed transmission. The engine was as beautiful as it was powerful, with its black cam covers and row of 6 big Weber carbs. The Daytona could run the quarter mile in 13.4 seconds at 108 miles per hour, very quick indeed. Top speed was supposed to be 180 miles per hour. I saw a bit over 160 once on a fairly long and empty bit of highway, but ran out of room for more. It also ran out of nerve when I remembered those tires had been sitting for months. I think that's the fastest I've ever traveled on the ground. A Ferrari Daytona Spider model was used in the 1976 movie Gumball Rally. Fun movie to watch today. The actors did most of their own stunt driving at speeds up to 100 miles per hour. And saving the best for last. A red Daytona coupe was featured on the cover and fold-out of the Carpenters' 1973 album, Now and Then. When we listen to Sweet Karen, it truly is yesterday once more. This is an Aston Martin DBS, Mr. Rathgeb's other car, his daily driver. Yes, we actually drove this car in the snow. Note the license plate, the boss's initials, and 007 for you-know-who. Aston Martin cars have a distinguished racing pedigree, winning Le Mans outright in 1959, plus the World Sports Car Championship title. The car shown here was driven by Roy Salvadori and Carroll Shelby at Le Mans. I was slightly nervous the first time I drove this car, and the office manager wasn't very reassuring.
And incidentally, we'd appreciate its return, along with all your other equipment. Intact for once when you return from the field.
Oh, you'd be surprised the amount of wear and tear that goes on out there in the field.
The Aston Martin DB5 has been called the most famous car in the world. Does any other car have the famous long-lived film association of Aston Martin and Bond? Starting with Goldfinger in 1964, Thunderball, on Her Majesty's Secret Service, The Living Daylights, GoldenEye, Die Another Day, Casino Royale, Quantum of Solace, and Skyfall. If you ever have a chance to see the 1971 and 72 TV series The Persuaders with Tony Curtis and Roger Moore, you can see a DBS in action there. The original Aston Martin used in that TV show was signed by the stars and sold not long ago at Bonham's auction for over $690,000. The DBS was a surprisingly large car, weighing in at around 3,800 pounds, powered by a 5.4-liter aluminum DOHC V8 engine that put out 345 horsepower. The transmission was a heavy-duty version of the Chrysler 3-speed TorqueFlite automatic. It reminded me of another pricey British automobile that used Chrysler running gear, the Jensen Interceptor. Okay, I know Bristol also used Mopar bits. Nice cars, too. Had a chance to drive a Bristol 410 once and... Sorry, where was I? Anyway, the DBS was the fastest production four-seater in the world at the time, one of a few cars available with fuel injection. It was a great highway cruiser and handled well enough. Certainly not as nimble as the Ferrari, but good enough to be fun to drive. No other performance car has symbolized class, British attitude, and capability like Aston Martin. It had loads of traditional English character, redolent of gentlemen's clubs and tweed and fine whiskey and grouse hunting. I certainly felt like Mr. Bond driving around in that car, but I probably looked more like Mr. Bean. Unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, Mr. Rathgeb's car wasn't equipped with a bulletproof shield or machine guns. That would have made getting through Toronto traffic much easier. Problem was, despite the best efforts of expert technicians, this DBS had recurring problems that left the boss stranded once too often. How can you chase down villains bent on world domination in a car that keeps breaking down? It got traded in on a new Mercedes-Benz 350 SLC in 1977. The Mercedes was competent and imbued with Germanic quality and precision, but it lacked the soul of the Aston Martin. Mr. Rathgeb was inducted into the Canadian Motorsport Hall of Fame in 1993. He passed away in 2005. The world could use more larger-than-life people like him. Well, I think that's quite enough for this episode. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed it, please leave a like and a comment. I'll be back soon with more of my life on wheels. Happy trails!